We're going to fly over a lot of Corinthians. We're going to land the plane every once in a while and make a few comments here and there. And I'll make specifically a few comments about 1 Corinthians 15. Okay, so we start out with just the typical introduction that we get. And again, that's a typical way that a letter starts, with a greeting and a thanksgiving, sometimes called a barakah, but just a typical way to start a letter. And then we get the first response to reports. And let me just kind of say what's on the outline and then make some comments about that. Of factions within the community, and then immortality, no, we don't want that. Immorality, other direction. Immorality, arrogance, and improper judgments, okay? So let me just kind of unpack some of what those are. As I said, the factions have to do with people who are claiming to be a follower of Apollos, a follower of Paul. I mean, they're dividing themselves up, apparently according to, you know, the one who's got the more perceived power or prestige. And the response to this is that the key, as Paul says, and let me just kind of go ahead and read this for us. It's 1 Corinthians 1:18, where he says, "For the message of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to those who are being saved, it is the power of God." Now, in essence, what he's saying there is the only way we're going to talk about power is if we talk about the cross. Because true authority, true power is going to come from the cross. In other words, again, it's ultimately what Jesus has done that is the basis. It's not other things. And I think it's interesting, he talks about the cross being foolishness. There's all kinds of ways we can unpack that. But at the very least, the idea of surrendering and laying down one's life and not trying to create one's own kingdom, that's the way of the cross, is foolishness in the world's eyes. Okay, so if you're going to have influence, we're often, and this is not just now, but typically the world's thinking is that in order to have influence, you must have power, and you must have control, and you must have access to a lot of wealth or influence or things like that. So in that context, the cross is foolishness, because the cross is about laying down one's life, is about surrendering, is about giving up. Okay, so the cross is also associated, obviously, with suffering and humility, which would be just the opposite of this kind of triumphalism, this sense of if you're really, you know, if you really are a follower, if you have God's blessing, then you'll have wealth and influence and power. Then he goes on and he ends that section, I think very interestingly, that with a discussion about only God can assess your true power, your true influence. And I'll just kind of throw this out as just an observation. Many of us have had it, but I think most of us are probably completely oblivious by God's great mercy to any of the impact that we really have. We think about all the times that God has used us to have impact on people, and we'll never know. But that's truly the indication of influence. And I think the caution of that first part of Corinthians, I think, is so helpful, because in a sense, we get really the joy and the freedom of being largely oblivious to any impact, knowing that by God's faithfulness, there will be impact, but we don't have to worry about it. And that's maybe, you know, you think about these missionaries who have labored in places with no fruit for their entire life. And only to have, I mean, this is a common enough account that we hear about, that only that we find that after their death, the church then exploded. And that fruit and all that work that they did that was completely oblivious to them was laying that foundation that was instrumental in bringing the gospel to a certain place. Okay, the next thing that I have down there is the report of the immorality. This is very interesting because there's actually two things that are going on here. There's the account of the man caught in incest, so he's sleeping with his father's wife. Now, that's bad enough, okay? That's already a horrific problem. But Paul seems to suggest that the real problem, and I'm not trying to give a priority to which is the greater problem, but at least together with this problem is the related problem that it seems like the church is boasting about that. So it's not only the question of this horrible sin, but they're boasting about it. So just to kind of give an example, I'm trying to contextualize this, that you might have, somebody who's living an immoral lifestyle and sleeping around with people and is boasting about it. Or somebody who is, boasting about the binge drinking that went on or something like that. I mean, it's not just the issue that we're talking about, it's the attitude toward the sin. That's also the problem. I mean, there's a real difference between people who get caught in something and are completely repentant and realize that was a horrible thing to do versus somebody who's doing something with an absolute callousness, not only insensitive to the fact that this is really a horrific sin, but also boasting as if that's what makes them important. That's what gives them influence. So this is in the church. Can you imagine what was happening outside of the church? I mean, come on. This is, as I said, we've got to pay attention to this. So that, to me, is the context where Paul says about handing this person over to Satan. That's 1 Corinthians 5. That's not an easy passage to understand, for sure. But I think that what Paul is basically saying is, if this is the condition of this person's heart, then we want to take away a support system that artificially makes them feel like they're doing okay and allow them to go to the end of themselves, so to speak. I mean, he still talks about treating them as if a non-believer, which means you'd be praying for them and praying for their salvation. So it's a difficult passage, but I think what he's trying to say is protect the church, get them out of the church because of the very, very detrimental effect that they will have. And allow them to run the full course of whatever they're doing. And pray that in that context they come back to Jesus. There's a lot that can be misunderstood in that passage, but I think there's a lot of wisdom. It's followed in chapter 6 by the whole idea of lawsuits that are being brought against believers by believers. And all I want to say is this, is again, does this mean that if something happens, you could never sue another believer? I don't like it when people try to think about things as always, never, nothing, those kinds of contexts. To me, wisdom is always looking at what's the intent of this passage. And I would say very clearly that if we're in a legal situation with another believer, I think that has huge implications to the world. I'm not saying that you shouldn't have a lawyer involved. I'm not trying to give an easy prescription on this. I am saying, though, that one would hope that churches would be a context in which wisdom could be used to resolve those situations. Perhaps even using a Christian lawyer to help navigate circumstances, to come to some kind of collaboration, to come to some kind of settlement. But it seems like there is something to be said about when two believers are hauling each other into court, so to speak, and I'm trying to say that a little bit polemically, and unable to resolve an issue, that it does communicate something to the rest of the world. And again, that's complicated. There are issues that come up, so I'm not saying that in kind of a blanket way. The whole next section then is some more questions that come up, questions about marriage, divorce, celibacy. This is a difficult passage, and the main thing that I want to talk about is that I think that Paul is probably dealing with two groups here, but at least one group that we can discern, and that is people who were advocating some kind of ascetic practice. So an ascetic practice would be a practice that is denying food. So people who would say that, you can't eat certain things. In this context, he's talking about marriage. So he seems to be talking about people who are saying that within marriage, denying sex. He's talking about, it seems like a very specific practice, which I think we can suggest is a group of people who are saying you're more spiritual if you do these things. And the whole context of what Paul is talking about is basically, I'll summarize it this way, but stay in the context in which you were called as a believer. If you're married when you become a believer, stay married. If you're not married when you're a believer, you don't have to run out and get married. If you get married, it's okay. Okay, so I think we can kind of mirror read a little bit here that there's some group that maybe is even saying, in light of Jesus' return, if you become a believer, everything changes. And Paul is saying, no. Don't withhold from each other. You don't, there's a whole bunch of permutations that he gives in that context. If you're this, then do that. Da, da. The bottom line, I think, is really to say, stay in the condition in which you were called. Again, he's not saying you can't get married if you're not a believer. I mean, if you're not married when you're a believer, but it seems to be a kind of a push that had a very unhealthy view of God's gift of marriage and God's purposes. But I do think it's interesting and worth pointing out that in the midst of all of that, he says, this is chapter 7, verse 21, were you a slave when you were called? Don't let it trouble you. In other words, your status as a believer is not jeopardized by being a slave. You're not less of a believer if you're enslaved. So don't let it trouble you, although if you can gain your freedom, do so. Very interestingly, in that context of situations he talks about, this is the one where he says, change it if you can. So I'm going to come back to that when we talk about Philemon and we talk about the issue of slavery, because to me I think that's very important to realize that in the overall context of what he's saying, that one example stands out, because he does say, if you're called in this condition, do try to change it, which I think is a hint that we're going to talk about with Philemon about Paul's understanding of slavery as being something that's contrary to nature. Whereas the other situations he's talking about is don't do things that are contrary to nature, i.e. a sexless marriage or something like that that was being advocated by apparently by this other group. Then he goes on to talk about questions, as I put there, food, idolatry, and freedom. Food offered to idols, Paul's own example, and then a warning. And I'm going to take all of these together as one example. The historical situation that he's talking about is that when you went down to the market and bought meat in Corinth, you didn't know where that meat had come from. Now, you may be arguing with me that the same is true today when you buy meat, but for different reasons we might be concerned about the sourcing of our food than we would be thinking about what the Corinthian church is concerned about. And that would have to do with the fact that meat was frequently sacrificed to idols. So in the sense that there would be a banquet, and the banquet was in the honor of a particular god or goddess, and the meat was sacrificed in that context and then sold in the market. So the question then would be for people saying, is it right for me to eat that meat if it was sacrificed in a context as a totally pagan worship context? So there's that whole issue. And what Paul is basically saying is it's a matter of conscience. If it doesn't bother your conscience, you're free to eat it, because those aren't really gods after all. But if your brother or sister, if it causes them to stumble, then you need to forego that. And then he talks about kind of his own examples where he has foregone certain kinds of things and has given up his own he's refused to exhibit or to demand rights that could have been his, where he talks about some of his own rights as an apostle. So he doesn't demand to be paid, something like that, where he gives up a freedom that he has for the benefit of others. Now, then he goes on and he talks about, but unless you misunderstand me, and that's chapter 10, idolatry really is a problem. And he used the example of Israel being led astray. So what he's trying to say is, on the one hand, this is a situation where you have freedom to eat meat that is sacrificed in this pagan context, because really those aren't gods after all. But if it causes another believer to stumble, then you need to forego that freedom for the sake of another believer. But, by the way, let us not pretend that idolatry is not a problem, because actually there are issues of idolatry that can be serious problems. And true freedom means acting for the Lord. Okay? So that's kind of the essence of the argument that goes on in those chapters. And I would just like to suggest that I think there's a lot that we can pull out of this. We're probably not concerned about, as I said, we may be concerned about the sourcing of our meat for other reasons, but probably not because our meat is sacrificed in some kind of pagan temple. So the direct application of this is not going to be that we're worried about that. Although, if you've traveled in parts of Asia, and I remember there I felt this the most was in Singapore and also in Macau, where going into a restaurant, there was always a little shrine everywhere, or any place you went, there were little shrines that had food offerings. So that's bringing up the whole ancestor worship context, which is a very real issue. So there are issues here that we're looking at that are directly applicable in some contexts around the world. But I would like to just say this, that there are any number of things that we can do that are neutral, so to speak. But in certain contexts, we will forego a freedom because it could cause a problem for someone else. Now, an obvious situation that's used sometimes is believers have widely varying opinions about the use of alcohol. So that's an obvious one. And it may be that you're feeling that that's okay, but you're in a context where you're with believers who don't believe that that's okay, and you may forego that simply because you don't want to offend them. I think there's a lot of application, I really do. But I think the bottom line is really to go to what Paul is saying, and that is there are freedoms that we may have, but we never have the right to demand those freedoms. True freedom means the willingness to lay down our freedom in service of someone else. A next major section that we have here, which is kind of the next big section of related issues, is that one, letter C, questions about worship, gifts, and order. And here's where we're going to talk about a couple of also controversial things. But let me just kind of talk about these in general terms. And obviously, if there's questions, you can feel free to ask. But just to anticipate where we're going, the final thing he talks about is questions about the resurrection. So you can see that this is a pretty, apparently at some point, random collection of questions. But you can see that he's systematically answering questions that have come up from the church. So the questions about worship. This question, the first one that starts out is the question about head coverings. Now, a lot of discussion about this, and what I'm just trying to do is to kind of help us have a sensitivity to some of the things Paul's writing about and how we might contextualize these. But it seems to me that the essence of what Paul is talking about with head coverings is a specific cultural practice where women, particularly married women, but women were typically married young, so that those kind of went hand in hand, would not go out in public without their heads covered. And to do so was a sign of disrespect to their husbands. Okay? Now, I'm not trying to transfer too much over, but to a certain extent we can kind of think about that in some Muslim contexts with a hijab, where women, married women, do not go outside in public with their heads being uncovered. Okay? Now, there's other things I'm not trying to make an equation on. I'm just saying, in general, that's a cultural practice that is done for reasons that are somewhat similar, interestingly. So I just want us to focus on the cultural practice. Clearly, Paul brings out other implications of it. But it seems to me that what he's saying is there's a way culturally that we can go into public and either honor or dishonor our marriage commitment, our marriage vows. And it seems that's the essence of what he's driving. He's talking about what are culturally appropriate things to do. Now, there are clearly some churches that say that women should have their heads covered. But if we look at the original context, the early church is very unique in the sense that here is really one of the few times that you see men and women who are not in the same family together in a public context. That's very unusual at this time in history. Now we're used to it. But it's very unusual to think about men and women together in a public context like this. And so it's possible to construct a scenario where women coming into these churches were saying, hey, I have freedom. I don't have to wear that head covering in this context. That, to me, seems to be the background of what Paul is talking about. Now, how do we contextualize that today? I'm looking around, I don't see any head coverings, so maybe we haven't contextualized it that way. Here's how I would say a possible way to contextualize it, and there's probably many other ways, but in our culture, by and large, there are exceptions, but by and large, in our culture, we signal marital status with a ring. That's a culturally acceptable way of signaling in a public context that you're married. So it would be perhaps along the lines of doing something that was culturally confusing or culturally dishonoring. And I'll just throw this out. It might be like somebody who's going on a business trip who doesn't wear their wedding rings. Okay, it's sending the wrong signal. Because in our culture, that's a visible way that marital status is often communicated. Not always. Some people don't wear rings. So to me, that's kind of helpful because what it's talking about is a cultural signal that is honoring and is understood in a larger context. So I'll let you know that that's one way of looking at this passage. There are other ways, but to me, that's the one that seems to make the most sense. And it's consistent with the passage that we just looked at, where the essence is really talking about freedom, but true freedom is not demanding that freedom, it's serving with that freedom. So it seems to me that's in line with what he's talking about. The proper conduct at the Lord's table, again, the likely background here is that wealthy individuals who did not have to work were going into the house churches and having the Lord's Supper and apparently consuming all of the elements, such that individuals who had to work and came later, there wasn't something for them. So again, think about the parallels there, that the freedom that you have doesn't mean that you have that right to use it. And true service would say, hey, I don't have to work, I can come here anytime. Wouldn't it be better for me to think about how could I come to the Lord's Supper, the Lord's table with an attitude of service and humility, thinking, how could I serve my brothers and sisters who come in after a long day of work? I mean, I'm adding a couple of background information things there, but to me that's another part of this overall discussion. That leads us to a discussion about spiritual gifts. What's interesting when we're talking about spiritual gifts, and there are 4 passages in the New Testament that talk about spiritual gifts. They're easy to remember because they're 12, 12, 4, 4. 1 Corinthians 12, Romans 12, Ephesians 4, 1 Peter 4. So I like numbers. I remember things with numbers. So 12, 12, 4, 4. Spiritual gifts. Got it. Okay. The one in 1 Corinthians 12 focuses tremendously on unity. The one in Romans, we'll talk about later on, has a slightly different focus, and that has kind of to make sure that everybody knows they do have a gift. This is really more on unity. So let me just point out a few things. This is 1 Corinthians 12:4. There are different kinds of spirits, but the same Spirit. Different kinds of service, but the same Lord. Different kinds of working or effects or influence, but the same God who works in all of them. Then he goes on to illustrate this with the body. Thank goodness the entire body is not a little toe. Although little toes are very helpful for balance, but the whole body cannot be a little toe, okay? So it's a picture of diversity in unity, diversity in unity. Now, knowing a little bit about the church in Corinth, we can see why that gets stressed, right? They didn't have a problem with the diversity. They seem to have had a lot of problems with the unity. So that's what he's going to stress here, and I think that's very important. But he also wants to stress something that I think is very helpful. And he goes on to say, at the very end, he talks about the many parts. At the very end of 1 Corinthians 12, he says, but eagerly desire the greater gifts. Okay, what's he talking about that? Then he goes on, digression, so to speak. Now I will show you the most excellent way. And he spends an entire chapter talking about love. It's perfectly fine if this gets quoted at a wedding. That's entirely right. But remember, the context here is a lack of unity, divisions within the body over the expressions of gifts. So let's go to the end of that chapter where he says, now these 3 remain, faith, hope, and love, but the greatest of these is love. Now, a couple things I just want to underscore. I think the reason why faith and hope don't remain is that they're anticipatory until we are face to face with Jesus. In other words, we have faith as objective content and also subjective experience, and we have a hope that, of course, as Hebrews makes very clear, in Hebrews 6 has already entered behind the veil. That hope is already where Jesus is. But when we're face to face, which is exactly what Paul's just talking about, now we see dimly, but then we'll see clearly. When we are face to face with Jesus, we will not need faith and we will not need hope. But love remains. Now think about other parts of Scripture. 1 John, God is love. There is something at the essence of the person, who God is, that is love. Faith and hope are anticipatory. So that's the essence of what Paul is talking about, because what he's talking about is at the core of the expression of gifts has got to be love. If there is not love at the expression of those gifts, then somehow something else is going on here. And that's where he talks about the Spirit and who's edified and all those kinds of things. But to me, that's the most important thing to keep in mind, because we really get this sense of it is possible to take gifts which are given by the Holy Spirit and to use them in ways that are not in love. If I have tongues that are like, angels, but they're not with love, they're like a gong, a clanging cymbal. So I'm going to just throw this out as a way to think about this. The whole context, particularly to a church that is rife with division, is the focus on unity. The whole discussion up to this point is you may have rights, but you don't have the right to demand the exercising of those rights. In other words, freedom comes from laying down, laying down, laying down. Then he starts talking about gifts. And in the context there, he's talking about, hey, I acknowledge there's all kinds of gifts. If you want to talk about ecstatic visions, hey, I can top that. I mean, let's talk about it. But the context has got to be that gifts bring about unity. Gifts are a manifestation of the Spirit for the growing up of the body. I mean, a person who lifts weights and only works on one part of their body ends up being deformed. Okay, you have to think about the entire body, working all the different muscles. And that's what he's talking about here. So I would just throw this out. This passage, in my mind, isn't really talking about whether we can speak in tongues or shouldn't speak in tongues, or whether there's healing gifts, or whether there's still charismatic gifts, or whether some of those gifts have ceased. I personally don't want to limit the Holy Spirit. I don't want to limit the kinds of things that the Spirit can do, and I have seen has done, and prayerfully will continue to do. But I do think we need to take very seriously when we're in ministry contexts and people say that either we have to show and exhibit certain gifts in order to show that we're actually believers, or certain gifts are privileged over others. And that can happen in a lot of different ways. I mean, you can go to largely charismatic contexts where speaking in tongues can be privileged over other gifts. I think in a lot of the contexts that we might be more familiar with, though maybe you go to... Thankfully, in our church, we've got all kinds of things going on in our church. But it is possible to go to churches where teaching and preaching gifts are privileged over other gifts. That's just as unhealthy. I think there really needs to be a sense that we need all the gifts. We need all the gifts. And I think if we're really serious with ourselves and understand the context in which we minister, there's a real sense of being aware of the gifts we don't have and the need for other people who have those gifts. And I think one of the things that we want to be really thinking about seriously, particularly if you're in a context where you could be isolated, like a senior pastor or something like that, I think you need to think, all of us, but we need to think intentionally about what are those gifts that I need to balance who I am, that I need to kind of help make sure that there's unity and balance. So I just kind of throw that out. I've been in situations where, ironically, I've been told by people that as believers we couldn't speak in tongues, and I've been in contexts where people have told me, unless you speak in tongues, you're not a Christian. So thankfully, there is balance there. But the key thing really is that there's unity in the Spirit and that there's edification. The body is being built up. In many respects, I don't think it's surprising that the final thing that Paul is going to address is the resurrection. It's not really the last thing, so to speak, as if it were not important, but it is the one issue that he's got to address with his church that really makes sense of everything else. So even though he's gone through all kinds of possible ministry situations that come up, the focal point at the very end on the resurrection of Christ makes entire sense. It also makes sense from this perspective that it's possible that the Corinthians were thinking that somehow they had already entered into kind of a resurrected experience. I mean, that there was what's sometimes called an overly realized eschatology, that they were already in the heavenlies experiencing these things. That sounds more like Ephesians than I meant it to, but just kind of a misunderstanding And so it's not surprising then that the focal point that we get here at this final section is really on the whole question of the resurrection. So let me just kind of throw out a few observations. We've already looked at the first part of 1 Corinthians 15 as a creedal statement, so I'm not going to go there again. But I'm just going to make a few comments here, starting in verse 20. But Christ indeed has been raised from the dead, the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep. So interestingly, we get similar language to the Thessalonians passage. The idea of falling asleep being analogous to, or another way of describing those who have died. But Christ is the first fruits, the one who is resurrected first. And because he has been resurrected, there will be others who follow. And first fruits, or the imagery there, of course, is the beginning of the harvest. So the very first part of the harvest that anticipates a larger harvest. For since death came through a man, the resurrection of the dead comes also through a man. You know, we're used to hearing that, but it's interesting to think about that that's affirming Jesus as fully God, fully human. So there's also obviously analogy to Adam. So this is where sometimes people talk about second Adam theology. For as in Adam all die, so in Christ all will be made alive. But each in his own turn, Christ, the first fruits, and then when he comes, those who belong to him. Then the end will come when he hands over the kingdom to God the Father after he has destroyed all dominion and authority and power. So now we've got, not only is it just resurrected life, but it is resurrected life in Jesus as the only true authority. Which, given the context of the Corinthian church and all of their problems understanding power and authority and all those kinds of things, this is a very important reminder. There is only one authority. There is only one who will be over all. And then he goes on to say, he must reign until he has put all enemies under his feet. If you're curious, that is more than likely an allusion to Psalm 110, verse 1. Psalm 110, verse 1. If you're doubly curious, that verse is either cited or alluded to more times than any other Old Testament verse in the New Testament. So Psalm 110, verse 1, is more frequently cited or alluded in the New Testament than any other Old Testament verse. The last enemy to be destroyed is death, for he has put everything under his feet. Now, when it says everything has been put under his feet, it is clear that this does not include God himself, who puts everything under Christ. But when he has done this, then the Son himself will be made subject to him who put everything under him, so that God may be all in all. Now, I'll stop right there, but I went through that pretty quickly, but it's a wonderful final encouragement, again, not only of Jesus' unquestioned authority, that everything will be subjected to him except for God the Father, so preserving distinctions within the Trinity, but also it's this wonderful statement that I think deep down all of us long for, and that is the final enemy to be conquered is death. And we live in a context, I think, right now where people are really wanting to say, oh, death is just a part of life, and we just need to accept it. And I mean, there's wisdom there as well. We have technology that can keep people alive far longer than a natural death would allow them, and we need to take that seriously too. If we understand we're going to be forever with Jesus, then the goal is probably not to be artificially kept alive for as long as technology can allow it. But on the other hand, I think we don't want to fall into the trap of kind of the world's thinking that, oh, death is just a part of life and it's okay. No, it's an enemy to be conquered. I mean, this takes us back to the garden. Human beings were not intended to die. And if you've seen somebody particularly ravaged by sin and going through a very difficult time period before they die, it's pretty easy to recognize that as an enemy. So I leave this with just, like Paul, wanting the Corinthian church to affirm, really it's all about the resurrection. All of these other things that we talked about, I mean, it's ultimately all about the resurrection, and it's ultimately about our final hope of being forever together with Jesus.